So let's begin today's episode with two questions. What do you believe? Furthermore, how deeply ingrained are those beliefs into what makes you who you are? A question I'm sure many of us have never thought about, but after today, hopefully you do. A quick reminder that although we have had 3 weeks in a row of the show so far, this show is scheduled to be a once every other week type of show. Gives me a little more time to write and research and such. So we will see you not next week, but the week after with our next episode. Also, a reminder, this show will not be on whatever podcast feed you're listening from forever, at least not the older episodes. New episodes will crank out, but if you want to check out the older episodes in a couple of weeks from now, you'll have to go to YouTube or Rumble. One more thing, here at Jerkcat Entertainment, we believe that this podcast is very important to the health of our nation right now. Hopefully you do too, and if you do, please take some time to give us a 5-star review. 5 stars is the only acceptable number of stars for the reviews, and share us with your friends. That one helps out a lot. Share us with everyone you know. Share us with people you don't know. Walk up to random people on the street and make them watch a video or listen to one of the episodes. That would be great. All right, enough from me. Let us get into today's episode, which is an episode all about your right to believe.
Religion must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is in its nature an inalienable right. James Madison, 1785.
Of the many desires human beings possess as a natural function of our existence, there is arguably none greater than the desire to express ourselves. If you think about it, almost everything we do across all cultures centers around the act of expression. Speaking, writing, music, dance, comedy, art, philosophy, debate, and that's just naming a few. No doubt these have all played a crucial role in developing cultures across the world as a whole, as well as each of us as individuals. Now imagine just how different your life might be if any of those things were ever taken away. Welcome to Your Bill of Rights podcast. In today's episode, we will finally be diving into our First Amendment, which, as a whole, is the recognition of our natural right of expression. Our First Amendment reads as follows: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Today, our focus will be on the first two recognized rights regarding religious liberty, or rather, the reason to believe. If this is your first time with us, then I highly recommend going back and listening to our first 2 episodes, which cover a few key definitions and philosophies regarding what we will be covering today. These things will help you better understand the First Amendment and all amendments going forward. For the rest of us, let us begin to explore the first third of our First Amendment. We shall begin by first exploring the actual text. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, legally known as the Establishment Clause, but in more colloquial terms known as the separation between church and state. There are many key words and phrases here. Firstly, shall make no law is a very powerful and definitive statement. It is not a suggestion or a plea, nor is it a temporary, situational, or conditional term. It is a permanent ban against our government regarding any laws having to do with a specific subject, in this case, the establishment of religion. Now, let's talk about the word Congress. In 1791, Congress referred to the federal government, meaning that Congress shall make no law was directed specifically at the federal government and only the federal government. This meant that at the time, the First Amendment, as well as every amendment in the Bill of Rights, did not pertain to state and smaller local governments who could, if they wished, create a much closer relationship between church and state. However, that began to change in 1868 with the inclusion of the 14th Amendment in a process known as selective incorporation. It's a very interesting history, but beyond the purposes of some brief context here, not really within the parameters of this podcast. Although it might make for a good bonus episode in the future. We'll see. For now, though, the takeaway is this, that while our First Amendment reads as Congress shall make no law, understand that Congress now stands in as government generally, and that the Bill of Rights applies to all government as well. Secondly, let's define some key words in the rest of this first clause. Respecting an establishment of religion. Keep in mind again, we are using Webster's 1828 dictionary as its language matched that of our founding fathers. Respecting, having regard to or in relation to. Establishment, a system of laws or something in a fixed, meaning permanent state. Finally, religion, any system of faith or belief in superior powers which govern the world. Moving on now to the second clause of our First Amendment, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, otherwise known as the Free Exercise Clause. Prohibiting, meaning forbidding or preventing you from doing something. And exercise, to practice, as in follow or work within a specific thing. Thereof standing in for the before-mentioned word religion. With all that in mind now, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, could be read in more specific and modern terms as, no one in our government will ever be able, under any circumstances whatsoever, to make laws in relation to the favoring of belief in any particular god or gods, and they can't stop us from believing and living within the laws of whichever god or gods we choose to either, because we can believe in whatever we want. There are very few examples elsewhere in our Bill of Rights where the language is as domineering and forceful as here in the first two clauses within our First Amendment. As we will further see in future episodes, Congress shall make no law applies to the entirety of the First Amendment. But note here that religious liberty is listed first. It's very clear to see that our founding fathers were very serious about keeping religious liberty intact, and they made sure to leave no room at all for the government to interfere with Americans' chosen beliefs and higher authorities. At first glance, one might come to the conclusion that this was done because our founding fathers were all deeply religious men, but this is not the case. Some were, some weren't, and most fell somewhere in between. But their unanimous agreement regarding the absolute right of the people to be free to worship as they saw fit does not find its roots in their own faiths, but rather within the rule of natural law. In episode 1, we learned that natural law can be split into two different subsections, primitive natural law and sophisticated natural law. Primitive natural law deals more in the realm of things like survival of the fittest, which we can usually attribute to the animal kingdom, as well as domineering power hierarchies such as divine right, which we also learned about in that episode. While there are some elements of sophisticated natural law applied to the elements of primitive natural law, such as animals eating each other still being within the confines of natural law itself, it primarily separates, recognizes, and distinguishes man apart from all other animals on this planet, therefore allowing man a different set of rules to play by, liberties to enjoy, and responsibilities to burden. To really understand why religious liberty was so important to our founding fathers, we first must understand why sophisticated natural law separates us from other animals, and it comes down to the one and only thing each of us as humans possess that no other animal anywhere on Earth does. Human beings are conscious creatures. We are aware that we exist, and furthermore, we are aware that our behavior affects the world around us constantly. In other words, man is the only creature on Earth that possesses the ability to reason, to discern, to make sense of the world around him so that he may not only make better use of it, but act accordingly within it as well. This is a process driven entirely by belief, or rather the act of believing. Logic and reason will conclude that if man has the natural ability of being completely aware of the world around him, then he also possesses the ability to form questions, thoughts, and theories about said world, which will eventually be answered and molded to form beliefs that will shape how he interacts with the world throughout his life. If the ability to reason is natural, then so too must be the steps that come after it, and thus the ability to believe is a natural process and therefore a natural right. But what drives humans more often than not to believe in a way that dictates moral and good behavior, or rather behavior that exists within accordance to natural law? It is religion in its purest definition, that being a belief that some authority higher than oneself dictates the cosmic rule of law. We can see here that, in its most bare definition, this applies to the most devout Christian, Jew, Hindu, or Muslim as much as it does the most devout atheist. Whether you want to call it God, Vishnu, Muhammad, or simply just the rule of law, at its most basic foundation it is one and the same, a belief, or even more minimally, an acknowledgement of a higher authority in which to build morality from. If conscience is a natural right, as it is, then so too must be the belief that sprouts from it. If government, which remember is not a higher authority because governments are only made of men and all men are created equal, were to impose a law restricting a man from his religion, then he would be imposing a law that would restrict him from his very consciousness, his ability to make sense of the world around him. History is filled with genocides, massacres, wars, and acts of terror in which unimaginable amounts of blood were spilled to quell certain beliefs. This was the disorderly chaos and violation of natural law that our founding fathers were all too aware of. If man is not free to pursue his morality by the dictates of his own beliefs, then only chaos can follow. It is the first basic element of man's existence, outside of life itself, which allows him to freely exist at all. It is why our founding fathers were so adamant about permanently keeping church and state separated, as this was seen as a double-edged sword. As much as they did not want the state to ever intermingle or interfere with any particular faith, they also did not want any particular faith to intermingle or interfere with the state. Either merger or infringement would surely spell disaster, corruption, and violence for both state and church, as history can show. The separation allows for each to do their work free from the influence of the other and thus create more pure forms of both. Let us actually take a second to notice how these first two clauses work in conjunction with one another to suppress our government. If said government were to violate the Establishment Clause and enact a law that showed favor to one religion, they'd automatically be in violation of the Free Exercise Clause, as this religious favor could be argued as a prohibition against all others. And if they were to violate the Free Exercise Clause against any particular religion, they'd automatically be in violation of the Establishment Clause, as one would be able to argue the suppression of one specific faith shows favor to all others. The brilliance in this combination is one of the most outstanding sections in all of the Bill of Rights. However, despite the outstanding nature of this pairing, that doesn't mean they haven't seen their fair share of challenges. When put into practice and put to the test, we will find that separating church and state has proven to be a rather complicated endeavor. For example, can a public school, funded by taxpayers and therefore a governmental institution, require their students to pray? The answer is no, as not every student prays to the same God, if they pray at all. This would be seen as an attempt by the government to establish religion. However, what if the religious students wanted to pray on their own accord? Would they be free to do so, and would the school have to make reasonable accommodations to those students in order to not violate the Free Exercise Clause? And if they made those reasonable accommodations, would that not show special treatment towards said students and risk being in violation again of the Establishment Clause? Kind of tricky, isn't it? We'll get into the answers, but first, let's go over a few more. Could a Muslim-led city council deny city permits to host gatherings in a public park to a local synagogue, or a Jewish-led city council do the same to a mosque? The answer is again no, as this would be a prohibition against the free exercise of faith. But wait a minute, what if that city council, irrespective of the faiths of those who sat on it, had a long-standing law on the books that denied any and all permits to host gatherings in that particular park? Would a city worker be allowed an accommodation to not work on a particular day of rest according to her faith? The answer here is yes, that accommodation would be required, as not doing so would prohibit said worker's free exercise of her faith. However, what about two employees whose spiritual ritual involved ingesting peyote during prayer in the middle of the day? Would that need to be accommodated as well, and would these accommodations show an establishment of religion against the non-religious? A few more because, frankly, I find these fun. What about a guy who believes he is a disciple to the god of marijuana in a state where marijuana was illegal, and his holy obligation was to distribute as much marijuana as possible to the masses? Or how about Pentecostal Christians allowing their children to handle poisonous snakes according to their faith? Or a voodoo priestess who requires an animal sacrifice during her prayer rituals? Or what about a priest of an extreme form of juju who requires a human sacrifice? Would the First Amendment apply to these religious individuals? The answers are as follows. Religious students are allowed to pray at school so long as they are not being compelled by the school to do it. Accommodations will also typically be made to allow this so long as the school does not actively expose non-religious students to the prayer or let it interfere with their day-to-day. The city council would, indeed, have every right to deny permits to the park to religious groups so long as the denial of permits was across the board to everyone. The city worker would be allowed her Sabbath because her scheduled days off have nothing to do with her fellow employees, and the city employer could also easily make many other accommodations to all other employees for all sorts of reasons. The employees who require peyote for midday prayer, however, would not be granted accommodation, as laws against illegal substances, as well as company policies requiring sobriety while on the job, would take precedent. As for our marijuana disciple, Pentecostal children, voodoo priestess, and juju priest, they also would not be protected under the religious freedom clauses of our First Amendment. And in case you were wondering, these aren't made-up characters. They are real examples throughout modern American history who have made religious freedom arguments in court and lost. It is important to understand, though, that they did not lose these cases for their beliefs. They maintained the right to believe whatever they want, free from persecution. It was a question of action that lost them their cases, not belief. Now, this is not a civics or legality podcast, so we will skip the details regarding the multitude of tests and theories our higher courts have developed over the years to determine whether or not the establishment or free exercise clauses have been violated. For the purposes of gaining a fundamental understanding of the limits on your religious liberties, though, we can sum it up this way. If a law exists on the books that applies to all citizens, irrespective of faith, and was put into law with the intention other than barring or encouraging religious practices or behavior, then it supersedes certain practices that may come with religious faith. Although, again, your right to believe whatever you want remains entirely intact and unobstructed. In this matter, the rule of natural law is still being followed. Our juju priest friend can't commit human sacrifices. Not because the government looks down upon or seeks to suppress his religious beliefs. That would be in violation of his rights. He is not allowed to make human sacrifices because murder, in and of itself, is against the law, and that law applies to everyone. Murder being an act which someone is deprived of their right to life and thus in violation of natural law. Animal cruelty laws prevent the voodoo priestess from sacrificing animals, child endangerment laws stop our Pentecostal friends, and so forth. While the government has zero business meddling in your beliefs, they are obligated and duty-bound to ensure that the natural rights of every citizen remain intact by the use of just laws. This means, as we will see with just about every right we cover in this podcast, that sometimes government and your rights will intersect. The question will always be whether or not that intersection is justified and whether it crosses the boundaries of your rights. These lines are not always easy to see, and that fact is no more apparent than here in the first two clauses of our First Amendment. Did local governments violate citizens' rights to religious liberty during COVID-19 when they shut down churches, but not other crowded establishments such as airports? Did President Joe Biden attempt to violate religious liberties by mandating COVID vaccines to government employees who may have had Christian Science leanings? Do public school teachers who are in fact employees of the government and therefore extensions of said government violate a parent's religious liberties pertaining to the disapproval of LGBT interest by exposing their children to the ideology while the child is at school? Does the government violate those religious liberties further if they enact laws that would allow them to remove supposed LGBT children from the homes of their parents if they don't affirm their gender identity? Is it a violation of religious liberties to remove tax-exempt statuses from churches or religious hospitals who refuse to perform same-sex marriages or abortions? These are questions that our courts either face today or will be facing in the years to come regarding religious liberty. While rather contentious topics, they are far from the first of their kind and also far from the last. They are topics that divide us all in opinion and interpretation of law, including our Supreme Court judges, which is why ruling in religious liberty cases has always proven to be difficult and even at times contradictory. It is a valiant and necessary struggle, however. Whatever cases may arise within each generation, the right to freely believe will remain at the core of the issues, and that right must be kept intact. Belief really is the core of these rights. It allows for both the religious to worship freely according to the dictates of their own conscience, and the non-religious to remain unaffiliated according to the dictates of theirs. It is belief that sprout the religions that grant man his ability to live for a purpose higher than himself. It is that tendency towards a higher authority which allows him to better recognize that there are laws above that of government endowed upon him by his Creator and are thus forever naturally his. Natural cosmic laws that will influence earthly laws which will benefit the religious and non-religious alike. If government were to be allowed dominion over man's natural ability to believe, then government would have dominion over man's conscience itself. If man is not in control of his conscience, he is in control of nothing else and thus becomes a slave, deprived from his liberty and pursuit of happiness, left to the predations of a government who itself would be made up of men similarly enslaved. Man's ability to believe is the first and most important step in his right to expression, and this is why religious liberty is listed first within our First Amendment. And man has no better defense of his conscience and right to believe than that of his voice and pen. And that is where we will be continuing next time. We hope you've enjoyed this expansive exploration of our first two clauses in our First Amendment regarding religious liberty. If you have found a great deal of value in today's episode, please join us again next week as we take a look at the next clause within our First Amendment regarding freedom of speech. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Your Bill of Rights podcast by Jerkcat Entertainment. This show was written with the following titles as its sources: The Bill of Rights by James Madison, The Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, The American Constitution by the Founding Fathers, The Know Your Bill of Rights book by Sean Patrick, The Bill of Rights, Understanding the Constitution and Your Freedoms by David L. Hudson, The Bill of Rights Primer by Akil Amar and Les Adams, Behind the Bill of Rights by Bill Norton and Jeremy Nelson, In Our Defense, The Bill of Rights in Action by Ellen Alderman and Caroline Kennedy, Webster's 1828 Dictionary of the English Language, Nature, Goodness, and God, The History of Natural Law Theory by Carrie Neitherman, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding by John Locke, The Essential Natural Law by Samuel Gregg, The Book of Deuteronomy from the Torah and New King James Bible, The Rational Bible, Deuteronomy by Dennis Prager, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, How to Run a Country by Marcus Cicero, and a various array of letters, correspondences, and essays by several of our founding fathers, including but not limited to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, and John Adams. All music is from epidemicsound.com and is remixed at Beer and Bourbon Studios. A special thanks to Jessica Castle for the opening quote. Your Bill of Rights podcast is recorded, mixed, and mastered at Beer and Bourbon Studios and is a product of Jerkcat Entertainment. Copyright 2024.